Kralvek Toynar stared through the observation window at the asteroid belt, tumbling lazily against the backdrop of a dim red dwarf star. Fragments of rock and ice spun in irregular orbits, their dull surfaces catching occasional glints of starlight. It was a sight he never tired of, despite having spent the last few months surrounded by it. The system was as unremarkable as any they'd visited, save for one thing: the gravitational anomaly buried deep in the asteroid belt. "Brooding again, Kralvek?" came Hisara's voice, her soft tone carrying a touch of playful inquiry. He didn't need to turn around to know she was smiling, her gaze always warm with unspoken optimism. He sighed, placing the datapad he'd been reviewing onto the console. "Brooding or thinking, take your pick," he replied. "This anomaly has me restless. I can't help but feel we're missing something." Hisara moved to stand beside him, her movements graceful as always. "You always say that. Maybe it's just because this isn't some monumental discovery." She gestured toward the belt. "Still, it's a beautiful place to work, isn't it?" Kralvek tilted his head slightly, acknowledging the churn of their surroundings, though his thoughts remained fixed on the reason they were out here in the first place. "Beautiful, yes, but also vulnerable." His gaze flickered to the fleet of drones outside, still circling the station. "I don't trust those things to protect us if someone decides we're worth raiding." Hisara's easygoing nature shifted for a moment, the thought sinking in, but after a beat she shook her head. "No point worrying. Trevok's got his head buried in calibrating the scanners, and you know him. He won't let anything slip by." She nudged him lightly. "Besides, the anomaly isn't going anywhere. Even pirates wouldn't know what to do with it." Kralvek offered a faint smile but didn't respond. Their operation wasn't a high-stakes one by galactic standards. They were researchers, part of a small academic consortium scraping by with limited funding. Their assignment? To investigate and catalogue the gravitational anomaly and gather data on its effects. There were half-formed theories about microlensing, or perhaps remnants of a collapsed stellar core, but so far, nothing groundbreaking. It was the kind of work that earned little prestige, and even less funding. Trevok's heavy steps echoed from down the corridor, a mix of irritation and weariness in his stride. His form appeared in the doorway, carrying a pouch of steaming stew in one hand, looking slightly frazzled. "I had to reroute a feed from the deep spectrum array again. The system kept locking onto stray asteroids." "That's because it's an ancient relic of a scanner," Hisara remarked, raising an eyebrow. "We're lucky it still works at all." Trevok snorted in amusement, sitting down at the table near the viewing window. "Lucky is pushing it, but it's still better than the drones. Those things couldn't find their way out of an open box." Kralvek, stepping away from the console and sitting down as well, gave a faint smirk. "Maybe if you lavished half as much attention on the drones as you do on the scanners, they'd surprise you." Trevor grinned back, his tone playful. "Maybe if the drones weren't patched together with hopes and scraps, they managed to stay in one piece long enough to impress me." Hisara laughed, her wings flicking lightly as she joined her two friends at the table. "All right, you two, let's at least pretend we're professionals for once." Before anyone could respond, their communicator signaled an alert. The trio froze for a moment, their attention immediately turning to the main console that dominated the center of the room, where a new message blinked in on the holographic display. "Unidentified signal detected." Kralvek got up from his seat and quickly made his way to the console, his gaze narrowing as he quickly brought up the source of the signal. "Grath," he muttered under his breath. "What now?" Hisara leaned over his shoulder, her expression focused. "What is it?" Kralvek's eyes tracked the rapidly streaming data. "Strange emissions near the star, and a signal. This isn't just debris. No identification codes, though." "Pirates?" Trevor asked. His voice clipped, suspicion lacing his tone. "Doesn't fit their MO," Hisara said, eyes narrowing. "They would have jumped in right next to us, assuming they know we are here." "Then what?" Trevor pressed, his patience thinning. "Some kind of automated probe?" Or something else entirely, Kravek murmured. He straightened, his claws tapping the console, thoughts racing. We're going to need full focus on this. Hearing this, Trevok and Hasara quickly finished their meals and took their places around the central console. Trevok immediately began to reconfigure the scanners to aim his instruments at the source of the signal, while Hasara began activating the station AI. The ship shook slightly as the jump completed, and Elliot immediately initiated a system-wide scan like he had done countless times before. Exploration could get monotonous sometimes, but it paid well and could show you some beautiful sights. It would take about 10 minutes for the scan to identify the orbital plane, and all bodies orbiting this star, so he passed the time archiving the last of the exploration data from the previous system. When the scan finally finished, Elliot opened the results. A few planets, a gas giant, an asteroid belt, and a cluster of unidentified signals right next to it. Shit, this could be trouble. Exploration data became more valuable the further out from human space you went, but could only be turned in once. In some cases, rival explorers resorted to violence just to prevent someone from beating them to selling the data. He quickly engaged the mass shift drive, setting it to the planet mass. The MSD worked by altering the mass of the ship to manipulate its speed. In this setting, the effective mass of the ship and all it contained was only 21.76 micrograms. This made any propulsion significantly more effective, allowing the ship to move incredibly fast, but not quite fast enough to push past the speed of light, thus avoiding any FTL detection. Elliot adjusted his trajectory, pulling upwards relative to the orbital plane like always. This gave him a top-down view of the entire system, which made scanning far easier, as you wouldn't have to worry as much about planets or a star blocking your line of sight on whatever you wanted to scan. The Deep System Scanner, an essential tool for any explorer, hummed as it deployed. It worked by analysing what might as well be entire range of light, from the planet length to ELF radio waves, to give him a full picture of the system. Within seconds, he focused in on the cluster of unidentified signals. The image and data that followed only deepened his confusion. That didn't look like any kind of spacecraft he had seen, more like a station. But how could there be a station this far removed from human space? The question practically answered itself as Elliot froze in shock. Remembering the first contact protocol, in which all pilots had been rigorously trained, he adjusted his communication systems to match the exact frequencies of the signals he had detected, and began preparing a message. How does one communicate with an alien race for the first time? You don't speak a common language, and probably don't have the same frame of reference either. First, he would have to establish contact. He prepared a signal containing a basic binary pattern, one that was clearly deliberate, one that, hopefully, couldn't be mistaken as random noise or an anomaly, and sent it off. The trio watched in confusion as the image of the strange object on their displays became clearer. The signal they had picked up was unlike anything they had encountered before, and the shape of the object defied all known classifications. By the way it was moving, it was obviously some kind of ship, but the station AI failed to match it to any known spacecraft in use by any assembly member state, nor did it resemble the common structures built by mining groups or rogue factions. The holographic display at the center of the console showed a 3D projection of the mysterious ship. There was a strange elegance to its design. When viewed from the side, it had a streamlined wedge-like form, tapering towards a narrow front. From above, it looked more like a long triangle with the tip removed. Hisara tilted her head slightly, her sharp glowing eyes narrowing as she examined the ship. "That's not like any ship I've seen," she murmured. "Could it be some kind of exploratory vessel? Or maybe a traveller who took a detour?" Trevok leaned forward, a heavy claw resting thoughtfully on the edge of the console. "This system is too far out from any standard station or outpost for a traveller to just be passing by. It's far too big for any kind of automated craft, but seems too small for a pirate ship. And I also don't see any signs of weapons or defensive systems. At least nothing we can detect." Kravek's gaze sharpened. "Whatever it is, it doesn't belong to anyone we know." He shifted his stance slightly, his tail flicking thoughtfully. I don't see any reason for the Coalition to come this far out, and we know it isn't a ship from any member of the Assembly. The three fell silent, studying the image in front of them, a growing sense of curiosity mingled with unease. Suddenly, the sharp beep of the communication system startled them all. The AI immediately displayed what it was receiving on each of their monitors. A burst of static preceded the appearance of a series of numbers on the consoles, once the AI managed to isolate the message from the cosmic background radiation. A string of binary code appeared on the screens. 0100 100 100 100 100 100 100 100 100 100 100 10. The trio stared in unison, momentarily struck by the simplicity of the message. None of them knew exactly what it meant, but there was no doubt that it was a deliberate signal. Kralvek narrowed his eyes. Interesting choice of format. Hisara's gaze remained fixed on the data, her sharp eyes gleaming as she processed the signal. Wait, she murmured, her voice low with realization. Could this be a new species? Some kind of first contact event? This message. It feels like they're reaching out to us, starting with something fundamental. A foundation to build understanding. Anyone who wanted to do work at the edge of explored space had to undergo first contact training, and some parts of this situation reminded Hisara of that training too much to just ignore. Trevok's brow furrowed as he scratched a few of his scales, not fully convinced. First contact? It could be, but we don't know that for sure. What are the odds of a first contact event happening here and now? Hisara tilted her head, her feathers ruffling slightly. Unlikely doesn't mean impossible. Why else would they be going for something so basic? They're trying to establish something between us, to show that they understand communication. They wouldn't do that if they could already communicate with us. Even if they were in an emergency and couldn't just send a message, they still have more effective ways of communicating that. Trevok snorted softly, clearly still unsure. I'm not so sure, but if it is a first contact event, we better be careful. These kinds of things can be unpredictable. Kralvek's posture was stiff, his sharp gaze focusing on his screen and taking in the signal once more. If we assume this to be a first contact event, the question becomes how we respond. They're clearly starting with the basics. I agree that they are likely trying to establish a foundation. Whether they expect us to reciprocate is the question. They could just be letting us know that they are there before sending another message. Hisara's wings fluttered slightly, a sign of both eagerness and caution. I think they do want us to respond. They're showing us that they understand communication in the simplest way possible. If we don't acknowledge them, how could they know that we have received their message? Trevok grunted, his claws tapping the console in a rhythm that conveyed his growing contemplation. If they want acknowledgement, then we need to respond in kind. Simple, but not too much. We can't afford to get ahead of ourselves. They might be more advanced than us, or less advanced. We have no idea what they might understand. Kralvek's tail twitched again, his mind processing the nuances of the situation. A clear response, but nothing that could be interpreted as a threat, nor anything that might be too advanced for them to understand. So we mirror their approach, maintain the balance. Letting them lead will ensure we don't go too fast for them to keep up. Hisara quickly typed a sequence into the console, a response that was similar to the binary message they had received, but still clearly different from it, not just a slight variation. I think this will do, she said, glancing around at her friends. Any objections? Kralvek watched the sequence flash onto his screen, his eyes narrowed in thought. After a long pause, he nodded. No objections. Let's see where it leads. Elliot stared at the string of numbers on the communications screen, situated on the left of his seat. The aliens had responded, their binary sequence subtly different from his own, but clearly deliberate. They were engaging, mirroring his attempts and expanding on them. The exchange was a confirmation. This was another mind, deliberate and aware. He leaned back in his chair for a moment, steadying himself. The training had prepared him for this, but the reality of actual first contact was overwhelming. The next step had to be methodical, deliberate. He wasn't just building a bridge between minds, he was laying the first stones for understanding between two peoples. He could not afford any mistakes. Elliot keyed in his next sequence, deciding to move beyond the simple repetition of his first message. The aliens had already proven that they could process binary and respond in kind. Now he needed to demonstrate structure, how smaller parts could work together to form a larger, cohesive whole. He began with shapes, a square rendered as a sequence of binary points, each representing a different corner or side. Then he added a similar image, this time a larger square composed of many smaller ones, each individually defined within the whole. The idea he hoped to communicate was simple yet profound. Data wasn't just a sequence of ones and zeros. It could be organized, layered, and structured to convey complex meanings. This was the foundation of language itself, components working together to form something greater. The response came after a few minutes. The alien's binary patterns had shifted as well, just like his own. What Elliot saw on his screen was unmistakably similar to his own shape sequences, but reconfigured. They had taken his initial square and broken it apart, rearranging the smaller squares into a new pattern. Elliot felt his pulse quicken. They understood. More than that, they were showing their ability to interpret and reimagine what he sent them. The realization brought a smile to his face. This was no longer just communication. It was the beginning of mutual comprehension. Elliot leaned forward as he composed and refined his next message. This time he built further on that same principle of structured data. He created a sequence that illustrated progression. A single square, then two joined together, followed by a grid of 4, then 16, each step adding complexity. The concept of growth, or building towards something greater. Elliot hoped it would help them understand that he was trying to build up to something. Again, he waited, the minutes stretching on endlessly. When the response arrived, it didn't just replicate his progression, it extended it. The aliens added another layer, forming a grid of 32. They were not just matching him step for step, but moving forward, collaborating. This was it. Elliot's heart raced as he moved to the next step. The principle of structured data had been established. Now he could prepare them for the payload. A large dataset on the English language, including audio files with samples of human speech and visual examples of most words and concepts. First, though, he needed to ensure they would recognize it as such. Elliot constructed an abstract diagram, a large square filled with smaller squares, each uniquely marked. It symbolized a collection of data, something vast yet cohesive. Alongside it, he paired a smaller series of shapes and symbols meant to suggest a key, a way to decipher the larger pattern. Satisfied, he sent the message. He didn't expect a perfect response. The idea of encoding and decoding was far too complex to fully communicate in such a manner, but if they recognized even the broad strokes of his intent, it could be enough to proceed. What felt like an hour later, his console chimed. The aliens had responded, their own diagram appearing on his screen. It was cruder than his, the shapes less intricate, but the meaning was there. They had drawn a similar structure, a larger whole composed of distinct parts, and had even attempted to include their version of a key. Elliot exhaled, realizing he had been holding his breath. They were ready, as ready as he could probably make them anyway. The first bridge had been built. Now it was time to send them the full dataset and hope they could take the next step toward understanding. He steadied his hands and began to compose his next message. First, the binary string that had started it all, followed by the binary square he had sent in his second transmission. Then came the square made up of smaller squares, then the expanding grid, and then the diagram he had sent in his previous message. After this came the language data. These are all ways to communicate information. He hoped to communicate to them, and this is another. Elliot was about to send the message, but stopped himself. He wanted to add something more, a way to reward the successful interpretation of this message. He pondered for a few seconds before recording an audio file and attaching it to the very end of this long chain. Kralvek leaned forward as he watched the latest transmission come in, his tail swishing as he processed the enormity of the transmission they were receiving. It was unlike anything they had received before. It started simple but quickly became incredibly complex. This is different, Hisara said, her feathers shaking in fascination. Look here. She gestured to the start of the transmission. That's the binary we received at the start, then the square, followed by the smaller squares. It's a repetition of how our communication has progressed. But why? Trevor leaned in. If the idea is showing how our communication evolved, could it be that there is some significance to that massive new part? I think we need to look at the full picture, Hisara replied. If this is a new way of communicating, we can't analyze it piece by piece. Agreed. We need a systematic approach, Kralvek said, as he accessed the station's AI, inputting the transmission. As the AI began processing, the room fell silent. The once chaotic stream of binaries slowly began to form organized patterns on the screen. For hours, the work continued, when suddenly an alert pinged. What's this? Kralvek asked, as he brought it up on the main screen hanging on the wall. Hisara's feathers bristled. Audio data. The transmission contains a whole set of audio files. She accessed one and played it. As the speakers crackled, an unfamiliar series of sounds filled the room. Trevor shot up from his seat. It's not just audio. It's language. Look, there's visual data too. Kralvek's eyes widened. That's it. That must be what they intended to communicate. Every transmission had a new and more complex way of structuring and communicating information. This is the next step. Spoken language. Then we can analyze the structure, Hisara said, eager. We can combine it with the visual patterns we've identified and start figuring out their language. Kralvek instructed the AI to sync the audio with the visual data, while continuing to try and decode the remaining binary data. The AI processed the information rapidly, overlaying both types of data in ways that started to make more and more sense. Eventually, the AI announced its completion of the task it had been given with a clear and gentle chime. The main screen showed videos, each with text below it that probably described the visual data. The text also had an audio file attached, which the AI marked as likely being the auditory version of the text. All three of them looked at the screen in disbelief when Trevor suddenly broke the silence. There's another audio file here, but it has no corresponding video or text. Kralvek nodded. Not encoded the same way. Maybe a message. Something for us to hear once we could translate it. Hisara instructed the AI to isolate this solitary audio file, and use the rest of the data to translate this new language, queuing the audio file to be translated and played once the AI was done with its task. Minutes later, the speakers hummed to life and a deep yet friendly-sounding voice filled the room. I am Elliot Kane, pilot of the TFS Ishtar. I am an explorer, and I speak to you on behalf of all humanity. We would like to say hello. The room was silent for some time as everyone processed what had just happened. Trevor was the first to speak. Well then, I guess we better open proper communications with Elliot Kane here and introduce ourselves. Hisara nodded, her feathers shifting with what could only be described as nervous anticipation. Let's open a direct channel. If they're willing to reach out to us like this, we should respond in kind. Kralvek was about to initiate contact, but before he could proceed, a harsh klaxon blared through the station, red warning lights flooding the room. His tail lashed sharply. What now? He growled, already turning toward the sensor display. Proximity alert, Trevor barked. The scanners automatically targeted the source of this new signal as the holographic display flickered to life, showing a large ship emerging from subspace. Its design and weapons made it plain for all to see. Hisara's eyes narrowed as she gripped the edge of the console. Pirates! And they're coming straight for us!